Welcome everybody. International treaties and other rules only make sense if they are effective, right? Yet how do we know whether this is the case? How can we analyze the effectiveness of a certain set of international environmental rules? In this short video, I outline how such an analysis could be conducted. We talk about regime effectiveness today. A regime is a system of principles, norms, rules, operating procedures, and institutions that actors create to regulate and coordinate action in a particular issue area of international relations. It is thus more than an international treaty. The reason why we look at regimes is that they capture the formal and informal rules and behaviors that result from or are linked to an international environmental treaty. A formal international agreement usually is at the center of a regime. But there's more. For example, international treaties are often implemented through updates of annexes, the adoption of guidelines, and of protocols. They also establish practices and norms, which are standards of appropriate behavior for the work within the regime. A regime is created through a sometimes quite lengthy process of international negotiations. International environmental agreements commonly take the form of a convention, or as in the case of climate change, a framework convention. They establish binding obligations for those countries that have ratified the convention. Since international treaties are negotiated among state governments, they generally bind those countries that then need to adopt national legislation to implement the requirements. Many conventions have annexes that can be updated to add or adjust provisions without renegotiating the entire convention. For example, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants has an annex on which the substances are listed that are restricted or banned by the convention. Conventions and framework conventions address policy areas such as climate change and biodiversity, which affect a range of sub-issues. For example, biological diversity links to the issue of biosafety, which refers to the modification of genetic material through biotechnology. On this sub-issue, the so-called Cartagena Protocol was adopted. In the case of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the convention sets common goals but does not specify rules on how to achieve them. For this reason, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted to specify the provisions of the Framework Convention. Later, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted for the same purpose, since the Kyoto Protocol had expired. Guidelines and similar types of documents are adopted by nations, but they're non-binding agreements. One example are the technical guidelines under the Basel Convention on the Transboundary Movement on Hazardous Waste. They detail, for instance, how certain wastes should be handled in an environmentally sound manner. The Sustainable Development Goals are another kind of non-binding agreement that outlines goals and broad norms, but without legal obligations for individual countries. How can we now analyze whether an international regime is effective? Regime effectiveness is a complex concept. It is difficult to analyze, and there are different definitions and approaches. For this reason, it is important to be explicit about what exactly we measure. One option is to look at the extent to which parties to an international environmental agreement have implemented its requirements and comply with its obligations. But this does not necessarily say much about whether or not the environmental problem has been solved. Rules could be implemented, but because of a variety of reasons, they could not lead to solving the problem. The international agreement itself could be flawed or not ambitious enough. implementing it would then not solve the problem. Or other rules or new unforeseen developments could counteract the anticipated effects of the agreement. For this reason, another option is to assess whether or not the environmental problem for which the environmental agreement was adopted has been solved. A related option, that also aims to assess the extent to which a problem has been solved, but in a somewhat different manner, is the counterfactual analysis. It compares the actual situation with a counterfactual situation in which no international environmental agreement exists, and the collective optimum, which is the ideal situation in which the problem is entirely solved. Establishing those scenarios is difficult, however. One aspect that always needs to be considered is whether there is a causal relationship between the adoption of the International Environmental Agreement and the observed effect on the problem. There can always be other reasons that can cause the same effect. When analyzing an international environment agreement's effectiveness in a systematic manner, three aspects can be differentiated: output, outcome, and impact. Output analyzes the laws, regulations, and infrastructure that were adopted as a result of the International Environmental Agreement. Outcome analyzes changes in actors' or countries' behavior. And impact looks at whether or not and to what extent the problem has been solved. Let's apply this to the example of the UNFCCC. In terms of output, there was the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and more recently, the 2015 Paris Agreement. As part of the Paris Agreement's process, countries need to adopt national policies and submit policy plans, which are called nationally determined contributions. And also as part of the Paris Agreement, nations have adopted rules that provide more details on how the agreement must be implemented. This is called the rule book. At the level of outcome, we could analyze whether there were economic and societal changes that have occurred as a result of the UNFCCC. This could be a shift towards low carbon technologies, for example. Innovations in the area of low carbon technologies could also be a direct or indirect result of the International Climate Convention. Moreover, the norms of what is appropriate behavior could have changed. Wasting energy could be perceived as inappropriate, while shifting towards electric cars or public transportation could be perceived as appropriate behavior. At the level of impact, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions would be an obvious aspect to analyze. Looking at how well we are on track to achieve the goal of limiting global temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius is another measure. This is not an exhaustive list, but rather an illustration of the different levels at which an international environmental agreement's effectiveness can be measured. However, collecting the necessary data and establishing causality for each of these aspects is not easy. Once we have established whether or not an international environmental agreement is effective, how can we then explain why this is the case? Generalization is difficult, since the properties of environmental problems differ widely. And of course, it is the combination of factors that makes the difference. In most, if not all cases, there are various ways to solve the problem. This links to the design of an international environmental agreement. Costs and obligations can be distributed differently to achieve the same overall effect. The more countries that cause the problem or suffer from it are involved, the greater the chance to effectively solve the problem and to avoid that some countries free ride on the efforts that others undertake. When countries and their population perceive an international environmental agreement as fair, they're more likely to comply with the rules and to make changes to their behavior or to pay higher costs. This links to inclusiveness. When not only governments, but also societal actors are consulted or otherwise involved, the acceptance and ownership of the international environmental agreement increases. When there's a large time lag between an action that needs to be taken and its environmental effects, governments and people tend to be less willing to engage in the action. This is because an action often incurs costs, while the effects generally generate benefits. If thus those who bear the costs are likely not to reap the benefits, or only in a far-away future, the support generally is lower. For some environmental problems, uncertainty of what causes it, how it unfolds, and how to solve it is higher than for others. Great uncertainty can decrease effectiveness. Not all problems are equally complex. Sometimes one solution can solve the problem, while this is much more complex in other cases. This is not an exclusive list, and it only are tendencies. There can always be a deviation from those insights. And as mentioned earlier, a unique set of multiple factors interact in each case of an international environmental agreement. These unique sets of a multitude of factors can explain that the degree of effectiveness of international environmental regimes differs widely. Assessing a regime's degree of effectiveness is challenging, and identifying generalizable success factors is equally difficult.